Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing with our interim series on Ludwig von Mises's The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality with Chapter 2, which is entitled The Ordinary Man's Social Philosophy. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series and throughout the course of other reads, I'll be doing an analysis and review of the read at the end of the read, so I'll put a timestamp in this video description so you can jump straight to the analysis and review part of the video if that's how you'd like to go about things. I also mentioned that this is merely an interim read, for two reasons. One, the book is kind of too short to do a proper series on like I've done in the past. And two, I'm doing this series really as a way to get your input. So what I'm looking to do is find out what it is you want me to read next. So in the comments section, let me know what you want me to read next. Yes, ulterior motive, I grant, but I'm trying to serve your wants and needs best. Like we did with our previous series, which you guys requested on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies and Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. So I'm trying to serve you guys the best I can. So please, in the comments section, let me know what it is you want to read next. Tonight, of course, we're going to be reading in Chapter 2. So without further ado, let's begin tonight's read, which is Chapter 2. The Ordinary Man's Social Philosophy. Part 1. Capitalism as it is, and as it is seen by the common man. The emergence of economics as a new branch of knowledge was one of the most portentous events in the history of mankind. In paving the way for private capitalistic enterprise, it transformed within a few generations all human affairs more radically than the preceding 10,000 years had done. From the day of their birth to the day of their demise, the denizens of a capitalistic country are every minute benefited by the marvelous achievements of the capitalistic ways of thinking and acting. The most amazing thing concerning the unprecedented change in earthly conditions brought about by capitalism is the fact that it was accomplished by a small number of authors and a hardly greater number of statesmen who had assimilated their teachings. Not only the sluggish masses, but also most of the businessmen who, by their trading, made the laissez-faire principles effective, failed to comprehend the essential features of their operation. Even in the heyday of liberalism, only a few people had a full grasp of the functioning of the market economy. Western civilization adopted capitalism upon recommendation on the part of a small elite. There were, in the first decades of the 19th century, many people who viewed their own unfamiliarity with the problems concerned as a serious shortcoming and were anxious to redress it. In the years between Waterloo and Sebastopol, no other books were more eagerly absorbed in Great Britain than treatises on economics. But the vogue soon subsided. The subject was unpalatable to the general reader. Economics is so different from the natural sciences and technology on the one hand, and history and jurisprudence on the other hand, that it seems strange and repulsive to the beginner. Its heuristic singularity is viewed with suspicion by those whose research work is performed in laboratories or in archives and libraries. Its epistemological singularity appears nonsensical to the narrow-minded fanatics of positivism. People would like to find in an economics book knowledge that perfectly fits into their preconceived image of what economics ought to be, vis-a-vis a discipline shaped according to the logical structure of physics or of biology. They are bewildered and desist from seriously grappling with problems the analysis of which requires an unwanted mental exertion. The result of this ignorance is that people ascribe all improvements in economic conditions to the progress of the natural sciences and technology. As they see it, there prevails in the course of human history a self-acting tendency toward progressing advancement of the experimental natural sciences and their application of the solution of technological problems. This tendency is irresistible. It is inherent in the destiny of mankind, and its operation takes effect whatever the political and economic organization of society might be. As they see it, The unprecedented technological improvements of the last 200 years were not caused or furthered by the economic policies of the age. They were not an achievement of classical liberalism, free trade, laissez-faire, and capitalism. They will therefore go on under any other system of society's economic organization. The doctrines of Marx received approval simply because they adopted this popular interpretation of events and clothed it with a pseudo-philosophical veil that made it gratifying both to Hegelian spiritualism and to crude materialism. In the scheme of Marx, the, quote, productive forces, end quote, are a superhuman entity independent of the will and the actions of men. They go their own way that is prescribed by the inscrutable and inevitable laws of a higher power. They change mysteriously and force mankind to adjust its social organization to these changes. For the material productive forces shun one thing: to be enchained by mankind's social organization. The essential content of history is the struggle of the material productive forces to be freed from the social bonds by which they are fettered. Once upon a time, teaches Marx, the material productive forces were embodied in the shape of the hand mill, and then they arranged human affairs according to the pattern of feudalism. When, later, the unfathomable laws that determined the evolution of the material productive forces substituted the steam mill for the hand mill, feudalism had to give way to capitalism. Since then, the material productive forces have developed further, and their present shape imperatively requires the substitution of socialism for capitalism. Those who try to check the socialist revolution are committed to a hopeless task. It is impossible to stem the tide of historical progress. The ideas of the so-called leftist parties differ from one another in many ways, but they agree in one point. They all look upon progressing material improvement as upon a self-acting process. The American Union member takes his standard of living for granted. Fate has determined that he should enjoy amenities which were denied even to the most prosperous people of earlier generations and are still denied to non-Americans. It does not occur to him that the quote-unquote rugged individualism of big business may have played some role in the emergence of what he calls the quote-unquote American way of life. In his eyes, management represents the unfair claims of the quote-unquote exploiters who are intent upon depriving him of his birthright. There is, he thinks, in the course of historical evolution, an irrepressible tendency toward a continuous increase in the quote-unquote productivity of his labor. It is obvious that the fruits of this betterment by rights belong exclusively to him. It is his merit that, in the age of capitalism, the quotient of the value of the products turned out by the processing industries, divided by the number of hands employed, tended toward an increase. The truth is that the increase in what is called the productivity of labor is due to the employment of better tools and machines. 100 workers in a modern factory produce per unit of time a multiple of what 100 workers used to produce in the workshops of pre-capitalistic craftsmen. This improvement is not conditioned by higher skill, competence, or application on the part of the individual worker. It is a fact that the proficiency needed by medieval artisans towered far above that of many categories of present-day factory hands. It is due to the employment of more efficient tools and machines, which, in turn, is the effect of the accumulation and investment of more capital. The terms capitalism, capital, and capitalists were employed by Marx and are today employed by most people, also by the official propaganda agencies of the United States government, with an opprobrious connotation. Yet these words pertinently point toward the main factor whose operation produced all the marvelous achievements of the last 200 years. The unprecedented improvement of the average standard of living for a continually increasing population. What distinguishes modern industrial conditions in the capitalistic countries from those of the pre-capitalistic ages, as well as from those prevailing today in the so-called underdeveloped countries, is the amount of the supply of capital. No technological improvement can be put to work if the capital required has not previously been accumulated by saving. Saving, capital accumulation, is the agency that has transformed step by step the awkward search for food on the part of savage cave dwellers into the modern ways of industry. The pacemakers of this evolution were the ideas that created the institutional framework within which capital accumulation was rendered safe by the principle of private ownership of the means of production. Every step forward on the way toward prosperity is the effect of saving. The most ingenious technological inventions would be practically useless if the capital goods required for their utilization had not been accumulated by saving. The entrepreneurs employ the capital goods made available by the savers for the most economical satisfaction of the most urgent among the not yet satisfied wants of the consumers. Together with the technologists, intent upon perfecting the methods of processing, they play, next to the savers themselves, an active part in the course of events that is called economic progress. The rest of mankind profits from the activities of these three classes of pioneers. But whatever their own doings may be, they are only beneficiaries of changes to the emergence of what they did not But whatever their own doings may be, they are only beneficiaries of changes to the emergence of which they did not contribute anything. The characteristic feature of the market economy is the fact that it allots the greater part of the improvements brought about by the endeavors of the three progressive classes, those saving, those investing the capital goods, and those elaborating new methods for the employment of capital goods, to the non-progressive majority of people. Capital accumulation exceeding the increase in population raises, on the one hand, the marginal productivity of labor and, on the other hand, cheapens those products. The market process provides the common man with the opportunity to enjoy the fruits of other people's achievements. It forces the three progressive classes to serve the non-progressive majority in the best possible way. Everybody is free to join the ranks of the three progressive classes of a capitalistic society. These classes are not closed castes. Membership in them is not a privilege conferred on the individual by a higher authority or inherited from one's ancestors. These classes are not clubs, and the inns have no power to keep out any newcomer. What is needed to become a capitalist, an entrepreneur, or a deviser of new technological methods is brain and willpower. The heir of a wealthy man enjoys a certain advantage as he starts under more favorable conditions than others. But his task in the rivalry of the market is not easier, but sometimes even more wearisome and less remunerative than that of a newcomer. He has to reorganize his inheritance in order to adjust it to the changes in market conditions. Thus, for instance, the problems that the heir of a railroad quote-unquote empire had to face were, in the last decades, certainly more knotty than those encountered by the man who started from scratch in trucking or in air transportation. The popular philosophy of the common man misrepresents all these facts in the most lamentable way. As John Doe sees it, all those new industries that are supplying him with amenities unknown to his father came into being by some mythical agency called progress. Capital accumulation, entrepreneurship, and technological ingenuity did not contribute anything to the spontaneous generation of prosperity. If any man has to be credited with what John Doe considers as the rise in the productivity of labor, then it is the man on the assembly line. Unfortunately, in this sinful world, there is exploitation of man by man. Business skims the cream and leaves, as the Communist Manifesto points out, to the creator of all good things, the manual worker, not more than, quote, he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race." End quote. Consequently, quote, "the modern worker, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth." End quote. The authors of this description of capitalistic industry are praised at universities as the greatest philosophers and benefactors of mankind, and their teachings are accepted with reverential awe by the millions whose homes, besides other gadgets, are equipped with radio and television sets. The worst exploitation, say professors, labor leaders, and politicians, is affected by big business. They fail to realize that the characteristic mark of big business is mass production for the satisfaction of the needs of the masses. Under capitalism, the workers themselves, directly or indirectly, are the main consumers of all those things that the factories are turning out. In the early days of capitalism, there was still a considerable time lag between the emergence of an innovation and its becoming accessible to the masses. About 60 years ago, Gabriel Tarde was right in pointing out that an industrial innovation is the fancy of a minority before it becomes the need of everybody. What was considered first as an extravagance turns later into a customary requisite of all and sundry. This statement was still correct with regard to the popularization of the automobile. But big-scale production by big business has shortened and almost eliminated this time lag. Modern innovations can only be produced profitably according to the methods of mass production and hence become accessible to the many at the very moment of their practical inauguration. There was, for instance, in the United States, no sensible period in which the enjoyment of such innovations as televisions, nylon stockings, or canned baby food was reserved to a minority of the well-to-do. Big business tends, in fact, toward a standardization of the people's ways of consumption and enjoyment. Nobody is needy in the market economy because of the fact that some people are rich. The richest of the rich are not the cause of the poverty of anybody. The process that makes some people rich is, on the contrary, the corollary of the process that improves many people's want satisfaction. The entrepreneurs, the capitalists, and the technologists prosper as far as they succeed in best supplying the consumers. Part 2. The Anti-Capitalistic Front. From the very beginnings of the socialist movement and the endeavors to revive the interventionist policies of pre-capitalistic ages, both socialism and interventionism were utterly discredited in the eyes of those conversant with economic theory. But the ideas of the revolutionaries and reformers found approval with the immense majority of ignorant people, exclusively driven by the most powerful human passions of envy and hatred. The social philosophy of the Enlightenment that paved the way for the realization of the liberal program, economic freedom, consummated in the market economy, capitalism, and its constitutional corollary, representative government, did not suggest the annihilation of the three old powers, the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the churches. The European liberals aimed at the substitution of the parliamentary monarchy for royal absolutism, not at the establishment of republican government. They wanted to abolish the privileges of the aristocrats, but not to deprive them of their titles, their escutcheons, and their estates. They were eager to grant to everybody freedom of conscience and to put an end to the persecution of dissenters and heretics, but they were anxious to give to all churches and denominations perfect freedom in the pursuit of their spiritual objectives. Thus the three great powers of the ancient regime were preserved. One might have expected that princes, aristocrats, and clergymen, who indefatigably professed their conservatism, would Be prepared to oppose the socialist attack upon the essentials of Western civilization. After all, the harbingers of socialism did not shrink from disclosing that under socialist totalitarianism, no room would be left for what they called the remnants of tyranny, privilege, and superstition. However, even with these privileged groups, resentment and envy were more intense than cool reasoning. They virtually joined hands with the socialists, disregarding the fact that socialism aimed also at the confiscation of their holdings and that there cannot be any religious freedom under a totalitarian system. The Hohenzollern in Germany inaugurated a policy that an American observer called monarchical socialism. The autocratic Romanovs of Russia toyed with labor unionism as a weapon to fight the quote-unquote bourgeois endeavors to establish representative government. In every European country, the aristocrats were virtually cooperating with the enemies of capitalism. Everywhere, eminent theologians tried to discredit the free enterprise system and thus, by implication, to support either socialism or radical interventionism. Some of the outstanding leaders of present-day Protestantism, Barth and Brunner in Switzerland, Niebuhr and Tillich in the United States, and the late Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, openly condemn capitalism and even charge the alleged failures of capitalism with the responsibility for all the excesses of Russian Bolshevism. One may wonder whether Sir William Harcourt was right when, more than 60 years ago, he proclaimed, "We are all socialists now." But today governments, political parties, teachers and writers, militant anti-theists, as well as Christian theologians are almost unanimous in passionately rejecting the market economy and praising the alleged benefits of state omnipotence. The rising generation is brought up in an environment that is engrossed in socialist ideas. The influence of the pro-socialist ideology comes to light in the way in which public opinion, almost without any exception, explains the reasons that induce people to join the socialist or communist parties. In dealing with domestic politics, one assumes that, quote-unquote, naturally and necessarily, those who are not rich favor the radical programs, planning, socialism, communism, while only the rich have reason to vote for the preservation of the market economy. This assumption takes for granted the fundamental socialist idea that the economic interests of the masses are hurt by the operation of capitalism for the sole benefit of the quote-unquote exploiters, and that socialism will improve the common man's standard of living. However, people do not ask for socialism because they know that socialism will improve their conditions, and they do not reject capitalism because they know that it is a system prejudicial to their interests. They are socialists because they believe that socialism will improve their conditions, and they hate capitalism because they believe that it harms them. They are socialists because they are blinded by envy and ignorance. They stubbornly refuse to study economics and spurn the economists' devastating critique of the socialist plans because, in their eyes, economics, being an abstract theory, is simply nonsense. They pretend to trust only in experience, but they no less stubbornly refuse to take cognizance of the undeniable facts of experience, vis-a-vis that the common man's standard of living is incomparably higher in capitalistic America than in the socialist paradise of the Soviets. In dealing with conditions in the economically backward countries, people display the same faulty reasoning. They think that these peoples must, quote-unquote, naturally sympathize with communism because they are poverty-stricken. Now, it is obvious that the poor nations want to get rid of their penury. Aiming at an improvement of their unsatisfactory conditions, they ought, therefore, to adopt that system of society's economic organization which best warrants the attainment of this end. They ought to decide in favor of capitalism. But, deluded by spurious anti-capitalistic ideas, they are favorably disposed to communism. It is paradoxical indeed that the leaders of these Oriental peoples, while casting longing glances at the prosperity of the Western nations, reject the methods that made the West prosperous and are enraptured by Russian communism that is instrumental in keeping the Russians and their satellites poor. It is still more paradoxical that Americans, enjoying the products of capitalistic big business, exalt the Soviet system and consider it, quite, quote-unquote, natural that the poor nations of Asia and Africa should prefer communism to capitalism. People may disagree on the question of whether everybody ought to study economics seriously, but one thing is certain. A man who publicly talks or writes about the opposition between capitalism and socialism without having fully familiarized himself with all that economics has to say about these issues is an irresponsible babbler. That concludes tonight's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So where chapter 1 in the introduction were basically what is capitalism and what is anti-capitalism. Here in chapter 2, the question that we're answering is why is capitalism good and why should you not be an anti-capitalist? Here he goes over the misgivings of the non-capitalist systems and all of the errors of the what you might call anti-capitalists, the Marxists, the socialists, the communists, the state interventionists. He says outright that the origin of their error is ignorance. In fact, this is the main thesis on page 28. Quote, "They are socialists because they are blinded by envy and ignorance. They stubbornly refuse to study economics and spurn the economists' devastating critique of the socialist plans because, in their eyes, economics, being an abstract theory, is simply nonsense." End quote. So here he's describing the opposition, the anti-capitalists, as dismissing as arbitrary something which is abstract because it is abstract, which is just stupid, just on its face. And I wonder if you guys have heard someone who's been in that situation. And we had a debate at my home, a brief one, if you will, in my home for Christmas when a relative came over and declared something as nonsense and most importantly, arbitrary, strictly on the basis that it was abstract, and that anything which is an abstraction is arbitrary, which is obvious nonsense. For example, something that exists in the abstract realm is like language. Okay, and the rules of language are the rules of language. Therefore, the elements of language that are built upon those rules are not. They're not arbitrary. They're built on rules, which makes them by definition not arbitrary. And those rules, and the notion of language is itself extremely abstract, but obviously it's not arbitrary. And the whole book is basically just a giant, does this sound familiar? And that's part of why I picked this book in particular for this interim read. Which, again, let me know in the comment section what you want me to read next. That's really the main purpose of this read. But I thought it was so telling that I thought this book was something. I actually read this book already, and that the reason I wanted to read this particular book as the interim read to collect your input is because, again, this whole book could be just one giant, does this sound familiar, with a constant reminder that this book was written in 1956. So it is true. So the main thesis we talked about was that the error of the anti-capitalists is ignorance. And it is 1,000% true that Marxists then in 1956 and now are ignorant of economics. But today they're not just ignorant of it, they reject it. It's not that they don't understand it, it's that they reject the notion of Austrian economics, even when reality forces them to experience its teaching by hitting them in the face with the reality that is before them. So what's underlying this ignorance goes beyond what I think, it goes beyond a simple and mere ignorance of economics and economic principles. And Mises kind of alludes to what's underlying that ignorance on page 26. Quote, "The ideas of the revolutionaries and reformers found approval with the immense majority of ignorant people, exclusively driven by the most powerful human passions of hate and envy, end quote. Again, does this sound familiar? But this is why but this is kind of alluding to the vehement rejection of the reality that's before them. So why are these anti-capitalists just rejecting the reality that is before them? And this is what truly underlies the anti-capitalistic mentality today. It may have been true that in 1956 we were dealing with simple ignorance. Here we're not dealing with simple ignorance of the facts. Here we're dealing with a more abstract and absolute rejection of a certain reality. And Mises actually comes so close to getting to the root of the actual answer on page 27. He lists a bunch of classes of intellectuals and then says they are almost unanimous in passionately rejecting the market economy and praising the alleged benefits of state omnipotence. The rising generation is brought up in an environment that is engrossed in socialist ideas, end quote. They're making God of government. That's what's going on here. And in doing so, in order to achieve that end, they're making science is being substituted by scientism. They're making effectively religion from science, which is not the purpose of the scientific method and has never been an element of the scientific realm. It's never been in congruence with science to make religion of science. This is how they can get to a point of fundamentally rejection. So the anti-capitalist mentality is today more rooted in this fundamental rejection of the notion that science and religion are separate concepts. Here, and what you'll notice is that in religions, in order to pass on the ideas into your progeny, you're talking about something of an indoctrination. So in this case, what he's basically implying too, but he's not quite there, is that in treating science as a religion, in converting science to scientism and making God of government, what you wind up doing with your children in teaching your children is you teach these core foundational principles before you teach anything else, and you get the indoctrination of children in the process. It's a core belief system and a core value system that suggests that government is God and God is government. And because government is God, God solves all ills, and then science can then bend to government, and there's no limit to what government ought to do. It's also hard to abstract an ought from the is if you're just living in the religious world of scientism. In this way, free markets exist as enemies of government because they have not been made one and the same. So this is where you get the conversion. In order to be like God, in order to be good, then a market must be consumed by God, in this case, government. So I think that this is just a tiny bit of a misstep. Mises gets so close to saying it, but at its core, what's I think really happening today, and what probably happened in the era of, say, Marx, is the making of God from government. This is also, by the way, how you get the notion that the technological advancement of the Industrial Revolution just happened. If you're separating the technological and historical advancement from the ideas, the abstract ideas that would allow those things to take place, if you're saying that free markets are just axiomatically evil, then they couldn't possibly have spurned this good thing, which is science that we're making a religion out of, right? It exists as direct opposition. Therefore, it couldn't possibly be good. Therefore, it couldn't possibly be the origin of the cause of the good. And this idea that the Industrial Revolution just happened is something that Ludwig von Mises explains on page 25. Quote, as John Doe sees it, all those new industries that are supplying him with amenities unknown to his father came into being by some mythical agency called progress. Capital accumulation, entrepreneurship, and technological ingenuity did not contribute anything to the spontaneous generation of prosperity. End quote. So then why did it take place when it happened? Why didn't the Industrial Revolution happen in, say, 1520? Why was it that James Watt's invention of the steam engine happened when it did? Why couldn't it happen in 1420? Why couldn't we have had all of the progress that led to 1750 happen in a more condensed time period? Why couldn't that happen, say, instead of from the year 400 AD to the year 1750? Why couldn't that have happened from the year 400 to the year 1000 AD? Why couldn't we have that rapid technological advancement? What allowed that accumulation of knowledge in industry and allowed that growth in the first place? Why did that happen where it happened, when it happened, and not in other places that already had, for example, that technological basis? How can one accumulate that capital if he is not allowed singularly to own the fruit of his labor, his capital, right? According to Mises, the Industrial Revolution happened when and how it did because capitalism was allowed to exist. And this is why the Soviet Union and Russia under communism got poor as hell, right? Not just poor, but really poor. This is why Venezuela, which was once the crown jewel of Latin America, and especially the crown jewel of South America, with some of the largest oil reserves in the world. This is how Venezuela can go from a country that was on the brink of joining the first world in the OECD countries to being one of the poorest countries on earth. Excuse me. Well, I felt a sneeze coming. Guess I didn't. And again, the reason this is the case is because there is no assurity of private property protections, right? Although government doesn't necessarily own the whole of the means of production, without that assurity in the private sector that you will own the fruit of your own labor, that you will be able to that you will be allowed legally to accumulate your own capital and not worry about it being just arbitrarily taken by government out of nowhere, and which is what happened. There was a lot of foreign investment coming into Venezuela, and then the state came in and said, we're just going to completely gobble up some of these industries, right, and some of these businesses completely arbitrarily. We're just going to take them. And the reason we're taking them is to more equitably distribute the fruit of that productivity. So what happened in all of that foreign investment, all of that capital that was there was like, goodbye, and then the rug and floor came out underneath them. So to those that criticize me for using, Venezuela is just the go-to for the right wing, well, there's a reason for that. It's because it happened in our lifetimes, and it's so painfully obvious what happened. Of course, it's going to be the go-to. And the argument that, it's just the go-to is a non-argument. Venezuela enacted the exact policies that Marxism would prescribe, the exact policies that Lenin instituted and were furthered by Stalin throughout the Soviet Union. It's the exact process that led to the Holodomor. And it's not that Venezuela necessarily consumed everything. It's not that they subsumed the totality of private property. It's that they made these protections disappear. It was that in 1750, in the late 1700s, you finally started to get actual legal protections of private property that allowed for people to safely and surely and securely accumulate all of this wealth, to accumulate all of this capital in a way that allowed them to build things like the steam engine. And with the steam engine, then make more steam engines, freely exchange those steam engines so that people who have a ton of money built up can buy the steam engine to make something else, which requires even more capital. And, this is where we get kind of into, I'd love to delve into Marx's dumb distinction without a difference between private versus personal property. But which is the rebuttal to this is either you own it or you don't. Do you own the thing? Then if it's yours, then it's private property. If it's the government's, then it's not private property. And there's no difference. This is a distinction without a difference to say something is personal property versus private property. Either you own it or you own it, or you don't own it. Either you own it or you own it. So the distinction between private versus personal property is, in one case you own it, in the other case you own it. So there's really no difference there. Which is it's one of the stupidest claims that Marx makes. And I'm bringing this up because this chapter in the Anti-Capitalistic Mentality, chapter 2, is where Mises first starts to make his more direct criticisms of Marx. And on that note, yes, I think in my future reads, I will, because we're getting to more direct criticisms of Marx, I will unfortunately have to start reading some of his books. Hopefully it's not going to be the tome that is Das Kapital. It's like 2,000 pages long. So hopefully I'm not going to wind up having to read that. The Communist Manifesto is a much quicker read to digest. So if you guys want me to read those books shortly, if that's what you guys want me to read next, let me know in the comment section. Again, the whole point of me doing these reads is to get your input. Let me know what you want me to read in the comment section. But in terms of the more direct criticisms of Marx, Mises makes this argument more distinctly when it comes to the Industrial Revolution on page 22. Quote, in the scheme of Marx, the quote-unquote material productive forces, end quote, are a superhuman entity independent of the will of the actions of man, end quote. He goes on pages 22 through 23, and this is going to be just a little long of an excerpt, but it needs to be said. Once upon a time, teaches Marx, the material productive forces were embodied in the shape of the hand mill, and then they arranged human affairs according to the pattern of feudalism. When later, the unfathomable laws that determine the evolution of the material productive forces substituted the steam mill for the hand mill, feudalism had to give way to capitalism. Since then, the material productive forces have developed further, and their present shape imperatively requires the substitution of socialism for capitalism. Those who try to check the socialist revolution are committed to a hopeless task. It is impossible to stem the tide of historical progress, end quote. And then he goes on further on page 23. The terms capitalism, capital, and capitalists were employed by Marx and are today employed by most people, also by the official propaganda agencies of the United States government, with an opprobrious connotation. Yet these words pertinently point toward the main factor whose operation produced all the marvelous achievements of the last 200 years, the unprecedented improvement of the average standard of living for a continually increasing population. What distinguishes modern industrial conditions in the capitalistic countries from those of the pre-capitalistic ages, as well as from those prevailing today in the so-called underdeveloped countries, is the amount of the supply of capital. No technological improvement can be put to work if the capital required has not previously been accumulated by saving. And then he goes on and, sorry, that was not the excerpt I meant to read. Sorry, the excerpt from page 23 is, quote, there is, Marx thinks, in the course of historical evolution, an irrepressible tendency toward a continuous increase in the quote-unquote productivity of his labor, end quote. As in, Marx treats progress as inevitable. This is obviously not true because we had the Dark Ages where we actually retrogressed, we regressed. And by the way, progress towards what? What's the thing that we're progressing towards? If the thing that we're progressing towards is something terrible, well, shouldn't we do something to stop that? Isn't that actually a bad thing? Further, Marx argues the technological progress begat the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and that's obviously false. You can't have the example of Smith's lesson without free exchange. We've gone over this a million times, where anytime you exchange something under mutually consensual terms, both parties benefit, and it's self-evidently true. I wouldn't give the $2 for the candy bar to the clerk if If the gas station didn't want the $2 more than they wanted the candy bar, and I wanted the candy bar more than I wanted the $2, therefore we value the two things actually differently. So that's subjective value of theory proved, and Marx disproved. Excuse me. But you can't have that without that free exchange. There's no way to even determine if an exchange is mutually beneficial if it's not mutually consensual. And the other thing, too, is that all of those things that allow some people to get rich under capitalism are the same things that are employed by the common man to make his life better. So, for instance, if you're super rich and because you have a factory and you have this huge accumulation of capital built into the factory and into your business with all of these machines and tools, then the workers that are working those machines and tools are now way, 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 way more productive than they were when they were just using their bare hands. As such, since their level of productivity is increased, then their own level of wealth must necessarily be increased because the product of their labor in terms of its exchangeable value has also increased. And remember, too, that currency is nothing more than a medium of exchange, and it represents, in the end, the productivity of somebody's labor. So if the productivity of your labor tends to increase, then necessarily the amount of money in real terms that you're accumulating must be increased. This is self-evidently true. And ipso facto, too, the rich did not and cannot possibly get rich by exploiting the poor. That's impossible. There's nothing for you to exploit from them. They either need to have a consensual exchange for their labor in which you give them something in return for that labor that they perceive as being more valuable than that labor, mutual consent. And in that case, they benefit. The 8-hour shift I put in at the factory must be worth more to me, right? That whatever you're giving me must be worth more to me than the 8 hours I'm spending in that factory. Or it's not consensual, obviously, self-evidently. And if that's the case, I benefit because I want the thing that you're giving me more than I want the 8 hours that I wind up spending in your factory. Mises points this out on pages 23 to 24. And this is the excerpt that we read previously. I'll just blow through it as fast as I can because we just read it by accident. Got a little bit of ahead of ourselves. The terms capitalism, capital, and capitalists were employed by Marx and are today employed by most people, also by the official propaganda agencies of the United States government, with an opprobrious connotation. Yet these words pertinently point toward the main factor whose operation produced all the marvelous achievements of the last 200 years, the unprecedented improvement of the average standard of living for a continually increasing population. What distinguishes modern industrial conditions in the capitalistic countries from those of the pre-capitalistic ages, as well as from those prevailing today in the so-called underdeveloped countries, is the amount of the supply of capital. No technological improvement can be put to work if the capital required has not been previously accumulated by saving. And if you don't have private property rights and protections of them, of private property, then there's no way to, in a secure manner, actually have that savings. So this is my favorite chapter in the book. There's 5 chapters in the book. It's my favorite read. It's the most thorough debunking of what he's going over. And I think it raises his point most clearly. I wish he wasn't so needlessly verbose. So the first chapter I struggled with the most in terms of the read, and you guys could see it in the hard cuts I constantly had to make while I was doing that raw read. But this is still not an introductory level read. This is an intermediate read, and it's kind of why I'm doing this analysis and review, because for those who had a hard time understanding it, it's not an easy read. So I wish it wasn't. Wish it wasn't so needlessly verbose. Again, this is something I talked about in the first chapter, how this exact same chapter, which was 8 incredibly dense pages, somebody like, say, Hazlitt or Sowell could probably do in 6 significantly less dense pages. And instead of it taking me over half an hour to get through the read, it would be more like something like 15 or 16 minutes to get through the read. And I also love this chapter because here we get into the more direct criticisms of Marx. And they reveal the true nature of the book as being more philosophically oriented than oriented towards economics. Probably why this book is shorter than most of Mises's works, and probably why I find it a better read than most of Mises's works, because I'm more interested, honestly, in philosophy than I am in economics. But it is the best chapter in the read, despite its complexity of language. Again, I love the debunking of the more direct debunking of Marx. We didn't include any of Marx's direct quotes in our analysis and review, but he does include it in this chapter. He will include them moving forward in chapters 3 and 4. But this is where the more direct debunking of Marx takes place. And again, a huge part of why I was doing this read in the first place is because so much of this could just be filed under the heading of, does this sound familiar? And we got that with this chapter in a lot of places, which, which we got on page 24. Sorry, let me close this up. We're getting really long here. So let me wrap this up with another entry into the endless list of entries of does this sound familiar from page 24. This is just like the shortest and most straightforward, complete debunking of the Marxian ethos. Why I love it, why we're closing with it here today. Quote, everybody is free to join the ranks of the three progressive classes of a capitalist society. These classes are not closed castes. Membership in them is not a privilege conferred on the individual by a higher authority or inherited from one's ancestors. These classes are not clubs, and the inns have no power to keep out any newcomer, end quote. Love it. And again, does this sound familiar? Huge part of why I love this is because he understands that privilege requires agency, and requires someone with agency to confer it onto you. It doesn't just come from the damned ether. The fact that somebody is taller than me isn't a privilege. It is a material advantage on the basketball court, but it's not a privilege. Driving privileges are privileges. Free speech is a right, because even if you took away my larynx, I would still have the ability to write. Even if you took away my hands, I would still have the ability to use my feet to communicate. At worst, if I was some paraplegic in a wheelchair who had no ability to move anything but his eyes and could twitch his cheek like the character in the song in Metallica's One, or like Stephen Hawking, we have the ability to communicate. That's why the right exists without the right will always exist. It exists outside its own protections from government. This is not true of a privilege. A privilege is something that is conferred to you by something or someone with agency, which means it can be taken away. For example, voting is a privilege, not a right. That's why Vladimir Putin can't vote in a presidential election in the United States. That's why that's why infant children can't vote in an election. These are privileges that are being afforded to you and conferred upon you by someone or something with agency, and they can be taken away. Anyways, that's been chapter 2. We'll continue in this interim series with chapter 3 in our next read. And chapter 3 is entitled Literature Under Capitalism. So again, let me know in the comment section what it is you want me to read next. And then we'll continue on with this read with chapter 3. And until then, it's been Mike, signing off.